Here is the login portal, or rather a version of it. The portal itself can be customized. As you can see, I've added a background image, I've modified the color scheme to suit the brand, and I've added the company logo. Also, you'll notice I have a dedicated custom subdomain for my OneLogin tenant, and every OneLogin tenant receives a dedicated custom subdomain. We also have the ability to customize the text around the username field, and that's because the username itself can be customized. If you're synchronized to Active Directory using our real-time Active Directory connector, this could be the SAM account name, the user principal name, it can also be the email address, and it can be a username of your choosing. There are also some customizable links that you can create. I've created one here called Privacy, and this provides my users with a link to the privacy policy. This is written in Markdown and is very easy to use. You can also enable this Ask for Help feature, which provides your users with an opportunity to send a message to a pre-configured email address, for example, the service desk, if they're having an issue. And we also have the ability to allow users to reset their own passwords through self-service password reset. To reset a password, the user simply presses Forgot Password and enters their username. Pressing Continue, the user will then be asked to verify their identity using an authentication factor. On screen, you can see I have a virtual Android device, which is running OneLogin Protect. So I'm going to go ahead and select OneLogin Protect. A push notification is sent to the device, as you can see, which the user is required to accept and then verify their identity using biometrics. And now the change password dialog appears. What you'll notice is that the password policy appears on screen for the user. And as they satisfy elements of that password policy, those elements turn green. The user presses Submit and the password is changed. To log in from here, the user enters their username. Pressing Continue. What's happening in the background is OneLogin is checking that username for a matching security policy. Next up, the user needs to select an authentication factor to verify their identity. What you may notice is that I was not required to enter a password for this user. That's because this particular user has been configured to use the passwordless login flow. There are 3 login flows available within OneLogin, and I will share those with you when we get to the administration side of the presentation. This is what the user sees once they log in to OneLogin. There are 3 areas within the portal. The first is Frequents, which lists the 10 most frequently accessed applications by the user. The next is Personal. If this is enabled in the policy, this allows users to add personal accounts to their own OneLogin portal. And finally, Company. This shows the applications that have been provisioned for the user based on their role, and we will talk about provisioning later on. In terms of applications, there are over 7,000 applications in the catalogue. These are applications that have been verified and validated to work with OneLogin out of the box. Of those 7,000 applications, there are over 1,000 that include provisioning. OneLogin supports modern authentication methods, SAML, OpenID Connect, and we also have a forms-based authentication method as well. If an application is not in the catalogue, you can easily connect to it using our custom application connector templates. To access their application, the user simply presses the tile, and they are signed in to the target application. There is also the option to install this browser extension. The browser extension is essentially a duplication of the user's application portal. This allows the user to find their applications regardless of which browser tab they are currently using. While I sign out of Office 365 here, let's go back to the user portal and have a look at the user profile. The user profile is where the user can change their password as well as add additional authentication factors. We will talk about authentication factors when we get to the administration side of the portal. What I'm going to do now is sign the user out of the portal and show you what happens during a service provider initiated login. A question we often get asked is, what happens if the user attempts to access the application directly? In the case of my example, let's see what happens when the user tries to access Office 365 directly. You can see the user is being directed back through OneLogin, where they will be required to authenticate. After authentication, they are automatically signed in to their target application. And when the user signs out of Office 365, they will be directed back to the OneLogin portal and they will already be signed in. Now I'm going to show you the administration side of the portal. What you'll notice is that it's the same entry point to administer the system as for end users. The only difference being, if a user has administrative privilege in OneLogin, they will have this link to administration on their portal. Clicking the link, the user is directed to the admin portal. So the first thing we need to do once we get a OneLogin tenant up and running is add the users. And the most common way to do that is by adding one or more directories. OneLogin supports many directories out of the box. We have support for those IT-driven identities, such as Active Directory and LDAP and Google Workspace. And we also support those HR-driven identities, for example, Bamboo HR or Namely. If a directory is not listed here, we can work with it using our universal connector and OneLogin workflows. The Active Directory connector is the most common directory connector that we see at OneLogin. It's a real-time connector, which means it synchronizes between Active Directory and OneLogin in real time, including password resets. OneLogin can support multiple different directories concurrently, and we can also do provisioning between directories. Roles can be considered to be a collection of applications grouped around a quality. That quality is usually the job role, but it can be a task or any quality that you wish when you're designing out your role-based access practice. For example, I have a role here called Birthright. This role describes all of the applications that all of my users get by virtue of the fact that they join the company. A user can have multiple roles assigned to them. For example, if I was the sales leader, I would have the Birthright role. I would also have the sales role, and I would also have the executive role. Groups can be considered to be a repository to store a security policy. Groups in the context of OneLogin is different to, for example, a directory group. A group in OneLogin is merely a repository for a security policy, and it's used to assign security policies to users through mappings. Unlike roles, where a user can have more than one role assigned, a user can only have one group assigned to them at any one time. If roles describes the applications that will be assigned to users, and groups describes the security policy that will be assigned to users, mappings is the mechanism by which those are assigned. And I'll show you what I mean right now. Mappings is a condition statement and an action statement. In other words, if this, then that. When we're checking conditions, we can check any directory attribute for a value. In the case of my example here, I'm checking to see if the email attribute contains the text spacellysprockets.com. I can have multiple conditions, and I can match on any or all as I wish. I can be specific or vague in my condition matching. Actions describes the actions that we're going to take when we match on a condition. Specifically, we're going to set directory attribute values. The most important of those is we're going to set the role, in this example, to birthright. And we're going to set the group, in this example, to standard. We can also add freeform text to the directory attributes, and we can use macros to make a combination of directory attributes if we wish. Mappings are processed in a top-down fashion, with the last match being the prevalent one. In other words, if you have a directory attribute that can only store one value, for example, the group, the last match on that will be the successful one. As I said before, a user can have more than one role assigned, so the role attribute will be cumulative. Moving now to applications. As I mentioned before, there are over 7,000 applications built into the catalog. What I'm going to show you now is application provisioning. I'm going to use the example of Office 365 because I've got provisioning set up in my demo environment for Office 365. If I come here to the provisioning tab, you can see that enabling provisioning is very simple. I just tick the box and provisioning is enabled. We have the ability to do some workflow constraints during provisioning and deprovisioning, and we can decide how we're going to deprovision that user when the time arises. What's important to understand with deprovisioning is once a user's access has been removed from that application, they will be deprovisioned from that app. Speaking specifically about Office 365 in this example, we have the ability to add licenses when we provision an account, and we can do that based on mappings as well. So you can see on the example on screen, I'm checking that attribute called O365 license type, and if the value is basic, I'm going to provide the user with these licenses when the account is provisioned. And I have a different set of licenses if that value type is standard. So now let's have a look at some of the security aspects of OneLogin, starting with authentication factors. You can see here the authentication factors that we support within OneLogin. We have our own authentication factor, which is called OneLogin Protect. We also support SMS, security questions, voice, email, and others. We support the Microsoft and Google authenticators, and in fact, any TOTP compliant authenticator can be used with OneLogin. Importantly, we also support WebAuthn to enable that biometric verification, such as Windows Hello, Touch ID, and so on. It's important to note at this point that at OneLogin, we do not charge extra for the use of authentication factors. Now, let's have a look at security policies. There are two types of security policies we can implement in OneLogin. There is the user policy, which is applied to users when they log in, and there is an application policy, which provides additional security controls around specific applications. If I open the user policy, you can see that smart flows that I was talking about before. This describes the login flows of OneLogin. There are three types of flows available to us. The first is standard, which is user ID, then password, then MFA. We also have a brute force resistant password flow, which is ID, then MFA, then password. And we have that passwordless login flow that you saw before, which is ID and MFA. Regarding the passwordless login flow, rest assured the user does have a password. They are just not asked for it during the login process. Security policies can be applied to different users based on different conditions, and we saw that through the use of mappings earlier on in the session. Therefore, we can have different password settings for different groups of users. For example, if I wanted to enforce a more complex password length for my systems administrators, I could. With OneLogin, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to password policies. Here is where the user can update their directory password and unlock their accounts. This is how we enable that self-service password reset function that we saw before. And we can also decide which authentication factors we're going to accept for a self-service password reset. Coming now to multi-factor authentication. Here is where we decide which authentication factors will be available for which policy. Remembering that we can assign different security policies to different users based on conditions, I want to talk a bit now about Smart Factor. So Smart Factor comprises two main features. They are Smart MFA and Smart Access Deny. Let's go through them now. Smart MFA allows us to suppress the MFA challenge if the risk is equal to or lesser than a predetermined amount. When we talk about risk in the context of Smart Factor, every login event that occurs attracts a risk score from 0 to 99. That score is found from a combination of our Vigilance AI engine, some machine learning, and some contextual information. There are approximately 30 indicators that go into determining that risk score. To give you an example of Smart Factor in action, if I log in from my workstation at the same time of day in the same location on the same machine, over time my risk score for that login event will be reduced. And it could be reduced to the point that if this is enabled, we're going to suppress the MFA challenge. This is a very smart way to reduce the authentication friction for lower risk login events. Conversely, we have Smart Access Deny. Smart Access Deny says that if the user risk level is too high, we are going to deny access. In my opinion, it's not a good idea to have this set at the user policy level, because one of the ways in which that risk score is reduced is by successful logins. We can also whitelist the IP addresses to constrain our users to logging in from certain networks. An example of this might be if we want our users to log in from the VPN only. Coming now to application policies. Application policies are applied to specific applications. It provides us with that ability to do step-up authentication for sensitive or higher value target applications, and also allows us to apply that ring-fenced additional security control. You can see here we can include an IP address whitelist. This again allows us to constrain the users to specific networks or IP addresses when accessing specific applications. An example of this might be the payroll administration system. So you may want to say to your finance staff that if they are going to access the payroll administration system, they must be on the VPN. And in my opinion, this is actually a good use of IP address whitelisting. And you can also notice we have the option to enable Smart Access Deny. In my opinion, I think this is a good use of Smart Access Deny, because what it's saying here is, regardless of how the user has logged into OneLogin, if they're attempting to access a specific application that's protected by this policy, if the risk score is too high, we're going to deny them access. So it allows us to provide that additional security control based on the user's risk level. We also have the option to require another MFA challenge. So this is important, and it provides us with that step-up authentication, and we can even be specific about which MFA factors we're going to allow when accessing this application. If we like, we can skip the MFA challenge if one was received within the last number of minutes. Next, we have the event stream. The event stream shows all of the logging events that have been logged into OneLogin. You can see here there are many types of events that can be captured in the event stream of OneLogin. Importantly, we can also ship these logs out to a security event management tool such as Splunk or Sumo Logic, or in fact, any SIEM tool that can understand a JSON file. Logs are shipped every 10 events or every 10 seconds, whichever is the sooner. OneLogin also has the option to turn on a Cloud Radius server. This would be used for applying MFA to VPN connections and also applying MFA to Wi-Fi authentication. This is the end of the demonstration.